No, no, no. You can't do that. The monster has to fit its elements. Thumb doesn't fit its elements. You have to make it blue and spacey, really stretchy and rubbery, and give it a YWAH. It doesn't fit its elements! So there's this thing in the community where people think that every monster has to fit its elements, and it's pretty dumb. I'm not the first person to say it. A lot of people said it before me, but nobody made a video on it yet. So I am. First thing about elements. The main reason elements exist in the first place is gameplay and MSM. You have to get your monster somehow, and breeding is an interesting mechanic, so they went with that instead of something else more complicated. Second thing worth mentioning is what to do with elements. With single element monsters, you always make it represent the element. It should always show very clearly. With double elementals, if you can, you should make them represent both elementals. If not, it doesn't have to be it's not a big deal. Triples, you could sometimes bother with them, but you don't always have to bother with them. It's really not important for a triple element monster to represent its elements. Representing 3 elements and 1 design can be a little bit tedious. In quads, if it's a 4 element island, it should represent the island as a whole. If not, then it's the same thing as triples, where you just kind of have fun. One thing about elements is they are not something you always have to use 100% dictate everything you do in the design, except in singles. If anything, elements are just something you use to get your mind thinking and spark creativity. It is not a design requirement. Some things I think you should never ever do with an element is make that element associated with only one color. For example, still element and just making everything gray, hypno element making everything purple or pink, light element making everything yellow, etc. With all these examples, what you do here is you have to do a little bit more thinking. Steel is a horrible element 100%. Always go for something more diverse. So metal. Now you could do research. There are tons of different kinds of metals you could creatively use for a monster. Now you could have yellow, silver, maybe even blue monsters, and it makes sense. With light, light yellow and white are the obvious bright colors, but think of all the other things you could do with them. There are bright things like jellyfish, anglerfish, fireflies. They all use different colors: pink, orange, green. The possibilities are endless. When an element is basically just a color, that should be a clear example that something is wrong, because if the element is forcing you to limit yourself creatively, it's a bad idea. Now, one thing that is understandable is usually you have to do 5 elements in most kinds of elemental projects. So usually, one of these elements is just going to be a blank element. In my singing monsters, a prime example of this blank element is cold. With cold in my eyes, there are not a lot of ways to do cold other than the obvious ice and snow. And even then, that'll just tie into water. So what do? And they use the element for simpler monsters like Furcorn, Maw, and Jumpler instead of freaking out over monsters representing elements. Another thing worth pointing out is the stupid idea that if you do an element, it has to be an element that hasn't been used before. This is stupid. If someone wants to use rubber element, they are not ripping me off. That's dumb. You always want to pick elements that are like super diverse. You can make a ton of monsters out of them and have them still make sense for that element. An element shouldn't be limiting. It shouldn't be something like tomato element where you have a bunch of tomato monsters. That's not good. And kind of wrapping it off, elements are really meaningless, useless garbage when you think about it. Because, like, especially when you're doing fan-made stuff, there's no breathing, there's no slideshows, it's just videos on YouTube. The whole reason why elements exist in the first place is gameplay, but that's all gone when you're doing fan-made stuff. So, people worrying about elements in the first place is just kind of dumb. And to wrap it off, no, I don't give a poo-poo doo-doo about FUM not representing its elements. Stop whining about that. I hate you.